James Sullivan was feeding the chickens when the diplomatic shuttle landed on his property without warning, which seemed like the universe's way of saying his quiet retirement was officially over. He stood in his farmyard on New Terra, holding a bucket of feed that suddenly felt absurdly mundane, watching a craft with Gendari Imperial markings settle onto the cleared field he'd been planning to plant with winter wheat. The shuttle was sleek, expensive, and absolutely not something that showed up at random agricultural settlements unless something significant was happening. James had been a farmer for 12 years. Before that, he'd been a combat medic in the Krefter conflict, 3 years of treating wounded soldiers in conditions that had given him nightmares for a decade. He'd built a peaceful existence here on New Terra. Simple work, good neighbors, minimal contact with anything that reminded him of the war. Most days, he succeeded in keeping the memories at bay. The shuttle's ramp extended with mechanical precision, and beings in formal Gendari Imperial livery emerged. Even from a distance, James recognized the precise movements of trained guards, not threatening, exactly, but definitely communicating that refusing cooperation wasn't really an option. A Gendari diplomat approached with the carefully neutral expression of someone delivering news that would change everything. She was tall, elegant, her scales displaying the subtle color shifts that indicated carefully controlled emotions James had learned to read during the war. James Sullivan, human veteran of the Krefter conflict, service record designation HTF 2847 medical. Her voice carried the harmonics that made Gendari speech sound almost musical even when delivering formal statements. "That's me," James confirmed, setting down the chicken feed and trying to remember diplomatic protocols he'd never actually learned. "Though I'm just a farmer now, been retired from military service for 15 years. Is there something I can help you with?" "You are summoned to appear before Her Imperial Majesty, Empress Kurashin of the Gendari Empire." The diplomat's neutral expression didn't shift. "The summons is non-negotiable, but carries no implication of wrongdoing. Your presence is requested within 3 standard days." James's brain offered several responses: confusion, concern, the urge to ask if this was a joke, but settled on, "Why, I'm nobody. I run a small farm on a colony world. Why would the Gendari Empress want to see me?" Her Majesty did not provide explanation, only instruction that you be located and brought to the Imperial Court with all appropriate courtesy. Transportation has been arranged. The diplomat gestured to the shuttle. "You may bring personal effects but no weapons. Do you accept this summons?" James knew enough about galactic politics to understand that summons from Empress wasn't actually something you could refuse, regardless of the diplomatic phrasing. "I accept, though I'll need time to arrange for someone to manage my farm while I'm gone. How long should I expect this to take?" "Unknown, pack for extended absence. We depart in 1 standard day." The next 24 hours involved frantic arrangements with neighbors, automated systems to maintain essential farm operations, and James packing a bag while trying to remember anything from the war that might explain why an empress wanted to see him. He came up empty. He'd been a medic, not a combat hero or strategic asset. He treated wounded, followed orders when they made sense, and occasionally violated protocols when medical ethics demanded it. The journey to the Gendari Imperial homeworld took 4 days via their faster-than-light transit systems. James spent the time in quarters that were significantly more comfortable than anything he'd experienced during the war, trying to piece together what might have prompted this summons. The Krefter conflict had been brutal. Human expansion forces and the Gendari Empire fighting over territory neither side understood well enough to claim effectively. Dozens of battles, hundreds of skirmishes, constantly shifting front lines. James had been assigned to a mobile medical unit, treating wounded wherever combat occurred, sometimes under fire, frequently in conditions that made proper medical care almost impossible. He treated soldiers from both sides when circumstances allowed. That had gotten him reprimanded several times. Enemy combatants were supposed to be detained, not provided with scarce medical supplies. But James's training said all wounded deserved care, and he couldn't reconcile being a medic with selectively providing treatment based on which flag someone fought under. One memory kept surfacing, probably because it was one of the few times he'd provided extended care to a Gendari soldier. The battle in the Korevel system, urban combat in ruins that had been a beautiful city before the war arrived. James's unit had been pinned down, surrounded, taking casualties faster than he could treat them. Then Gendari reinforcements had broken through, not enemy combatants attacking his position, but Allied forces responding to distress calls from their own units. In the chaos, James had found a Gendari officer gravely wounded, her command squad dead around her, bleeding from multiple injuries that suggested she'd taken direct hits from high-caliber weapons. He'd made a choice: treat the enemy officer or fall back with his retreating unit. The tactical decision was obvious: retreat, survive, follow orders. But she was bleeding out, and he was a medic, and somehow leaving her to die felt like abandoning the core purpose that had gotten him through 3 years of war. He'd stayed, used his medical supplies on the Gendari officer, stabilizing her injuries well enough that she might survive until proper medical facilities were available. When Gendari forces secured the area, they'd found James still working on her treatment. Too focused on stopping the bleeding to notice, he was now surrounded by enemy soldiers who could have killed him immediately. Instead, they'd taken him prisoner, treated him well under various treaty terms, and eventually released him in a prisoner exchange 2 months later. He'd never learned the officer's name, never knew if she survived, never thought much about that moment because the war had been full of decisions that required immediate action without time for consequences calculation. But as the diplomatic shuttle approached the Gendari Imperial homeworld, James wondered if that officer, that split-second choice to provide medical care to someone who might have done the same for him in different circumstances, was somehow connected to why an empress wanted to see him. The Gendari Imperial homeworld was called Shinvara, and it was beautiful in ways that made James feel like a child visiting an art museum. Everything was intentional, architecture that flowed like organic growth, buildings integrated with landscape, cities that looked like they'd been refined over millennia rather than hastily constructed. The shuttle delivered him to the Imperial Palace complex, a sprawling structure that was simultaneously fortress, government center, and cultural monument. Spires rose in patterns that probably carried symbolic meaning, gardens created living art, and the whole thing communicated power through aesthetic sophistication rather than aggressive military display. James was escorted through halls decorated with art that predated human spaceflight, past guards whose ceremonial armor probably concealed serious military capability, into reception chambers where protocol officers waited to brief him on proper court behavior. When addressing the Empress, you will use the formal title, Your Imperial Majesty, a protocol officer explained with patient precision. You will bow to 15 degrees. Human physiology prevents the traditional 30-degree Gendari bow, so accommodation has been made. You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will maintain respectful distance of no less than 2 meters unless specifically invited closer. The briefing continued for an hour, covering dozens of details about Gendari court etiquette that James absorbed with the sinking certainty that he would forget at least half under pressure. He'd been a combat medic, not a diplomat. His training involved trauma medicine and triage, not navigating imperial protocols. Finally, after what felt like endless preparation, he was escorted to a private audience chamber. Not the grand throne room for public ceremonies, but a smaller space designed for significant but not state-level meetings. The chamber was elegant, walls displaying slowly shifting patterns that might have been art or might have been information, displays he couldn't read, furniture that adjusted automatically to accommodate different species' physiology, windows offering views of palace gardens where flowering plants created patterns that probably carried cultural meaning. The door opened with a soft chime, and Empress Kurashin entered with 2 guards. James's breath caught because he recognized her immediately. Older now, bearing the weight of ruling an empire, but unmistakably the Gendari officer he'd treated in the ruins of Koravel 15 years ago. She'd been younger then, a commander rather than empress, but her features were distinctive. The particular pattern of scales along her jawline, the way she moved with precise military bearing even in formal robes, the scar on her left temple that James remembered from when he'd been desperately trying to stop her bleeding. She studied him with the same intensity he remembered from that battlefield, and James realized she'd been planning this meeting for however long it had taken to locate one retired medic on a distant colony world. "James Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that his translator rendered as formal authority mixed with something warmer. "Do you remember me, human?" James bowed to approximately 15 degrees, possibly 14 or 16. His internal angle measurement wasn't precise when his brain was still processing that the Gendari Empress was the officer he'd saved 15 years ago. He managed to keep his voice steady through sheer force of medical training that said panic was counterproductive. "Your Imperial Majesty. Yes, I remember. Koravel System, urban combat zone in what used to be the Merchant District. You were Commander Kurashin then, if I'm remembering your rank insignia correctly. You'd been wounded by weapons fire, multiple fractures to your left side, significant internal bleeding, severe trauma that required immediate intervention to prevent shock and organ failure." Empress Kurashin's scales shifted to colors that James's limited understanding of Gendari body language suggested meant satisfaction or approval. "You remember with remarkable accuracy for an encounter that lasted less than an hour under extreme conditions." "Medical details tend to stick," James said. "You remember your patients, especially the ones where treatment occurred under active combat conditions with limited supplies and significant uncertainty about outcome." She gestured to seating arrangements, and they settled into chairs that adjusted automatically, James's rising slightly to accommodate shorter human height, the Empress's adapting to Gendari proportions. Her guards maintained position near the entrance but didn't approach, suggesting this conversation was meant to be private despite their presence. "I should provide context," Empress Kurashin began. "I was squadron commander during the Koravel engagement, leading forces in territory we'd been assured was uncontested. Intelligence was incorrect. We encountered entrenched human positions and were ambushed with precision that suggested our movements had been tracked and anticipated." She continued with the clinical tone of someone who'd analyzed this battle extensively. "My command squad was killed in the initial attack. I was wounded severely, what you accurately describe as multiple fractures, internal bleeding, trauma that should have resulted in my death on that battlefield. I lost consciousness expecting to die among my fallen soldiers." "But you didn't die," James said quietly. "Because I regained consciousness to find a human combat medic enemy soldier, kneeling beside me, using his supplies to stabilize injuries that would have killed me within minutes without intervention." Her scales shifted to deeper colors. "I remember watching you work with absolute focus, moving with efficiency that suggested extensive trauma experience. I remember thinking that either you were catastrophically foolish or operating under principles that transcended immediate military advantage." James was quiet for a moment, remembering that battlefield with the clarity that came from choices made under pressure. "You were dying. I had training and supplies that could prevent that. The specifics of which military force you belonged to seemed less important than whether I could keep you alive long enough for proper medical care. That perspective was not universal among your fellow soldiers," the Empress observed. "The Krefter conflict was brutal. Both sides committed acts that prioritized tactical advantage over compassion. Many human soldiers would have considered one less Gendari commander a strategic benefit, would have let me die, and claimed they found me already deceased. Some might have, James acknowledged. But I was a medic. My entire purpose was treating wounded, keeping people alive. I couldn't reconcile that with selectively providing care based on political affiliation. Seemed like if I was going to commit to medical ethics, I should commit to all wounded, not just the ones on my side. Empress Kurashin leaned forward slightly, her attention absolute. I spent months after that battle trying to understand your motivation. Was it political calculation, treating an enemy officer to gain leverage in future negotiations? Moral principle that transcended military context? Simple medical ethics that operated independent of tactical concerns? She pulled up a holographic display showing what appeared to be service records. I had intelligence services investigate your background. You treated Gendari wounded on multiple occasions, always at personal risk, frequently in violation of direct orders from your superiors. You were reprimanded 3 times for providing medical care to enemy combatants when protocols suggested detention rather than treatment. I got in trouble for following medical ethics, James confirmed. My commanding officers weren't always pleased with my interpretation of appropriate medical conduct, but I couldn't figure out how to be a good medic while refusing to treat wounded based on which flag they fought under. Your choice in Korevel saved my life, the Empress said simply. Your medical treatment stabilized me long enough for my forces to secure the area, to find me still alive, to transport me to proper medical facilities, where I received the care that ensured survival and full recovery. She stood, moved to the chamber's windows overlooking the palace gardens. What you could not have known, what neither of us could have predicted, is that I would eventually become Empress. That the wounded commander you saved would rise through military ranks, navigate political complexities, and ultimately lead the Gendari Empire. James processed this, the implications almost too large to grasp. I didn't know who you were beyond injured soldier who needed medical attention. If I'd known you'd become Empress, would it have changed your decision? She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. James thought about this honestly. No, I'd like to think I would have made the same choice regardless of your future political significance. Medical ethics should be independent of outcome calculations. You don't provide care based on whether the patient might later become important. You provide care because they're a person who needs help. Empress Kurashin's scales shifted to colors that definitely indicated approval. That integrity is why I asked you here, but I should explain the political context before making my request. She returned to her seat, and her expression became more formal, less personal memory, more strategic calculation. The peace between the Gendari Empire and human territories is fragile, Ambassador Sullivan. Both sides maintain it because renewed conflict would be costly, but genuine cooperation remains limited. Conservative factions on both sides question whether our species can coexist peacefully. I'm not an ambassador, James protested. I'm a farmer. I fix irrigation systems and harvest crops. I haven't been involved in anything diplomatic or politically significant since the war ended. You are an ambassador whether you claim the title or not, the Empress corrected gently. Your action in Korevel, choosing to save an enemy life at personal risk, represents values both our civilizations claim to honor. You demonstrated that even in war, individual choices can transcend political divisions. She pulled up more displays, showing what appeared to be political analysis and public opinion data. Conservative factions argue that humans and Gendari are fundamentally incompatible, that our differences will inevitably result in renewed conflict. They point to the Krefter conflict as evidence of human aggression, suggest that peace is merely temporary ceasefire before inevitable war resumption. And Gendari conservatives probably say similar things about humans, James observed. Exactly. Both sides have factions invested in mutual antagonism, in maintaining the prejudices and fears that justified the war. Breaking that cycle requires demonstrating that cooperation is possible, that individuals from both species can build genuine trust despite our differences. Empress Kureshin met his eyes directly. Your choice in Korevel proves that even under extreme pressure, humans can act with honor and compassion toward Gendari. If I can show my people that the human who saved my life represents broader human values rather than isolated exception, it strengthens arguments for continued peace and genuine cooperation. James felt the weight of unexpected significance settling on his shoulders. What exactly are you asking me to do, Your Majesty? Empress Kureshin pulled up additional displays, showing what appeared to be proposed diplomatic initiatives and cultural exchange programs. I am asking you to accept a role you never sought, to become a symbol of human Gendari cooperation that emerged from your commitment to medical ethics rather than calculated political strategy. She continued, specifically, I want you to remain at court as cultural liaison and ambassador of human Gendari cooperation, to share your story publicly, allowing both our peoples to understand the choices that preserved peace, to help me demonstrate to conservative factions that human and Gendari interests can align, that our differences need not result in eternal conflict. James sat in an elegant chair in an alien palace, processing a request that would transform him from peaceful farmer into diplomatic symbol. I'm not qualified for this. I'm a former combat medic who runs a small agricultural operation. I don't have training for court politics or cultural liaison work. I barely managed to remember the protocol briefing about proper bowing angles. You have something more valuable than diplomatic training, the Empress replied. You have authenticity. A story of genuine moral courage that resonates because it wasn't calculated for political advantage. My diplomatic corps can produce carefully crafted statements all day. What they cannot produce is the human who saved my life when military logic said to abandon me. She gestured to the displays. Let me show you what we're facing. Gendari conservatives argue that humans are expansionist, aggressive, culturally incompatible with our civilization. They use the Krevder conflict as evidence, point to territorial disputes and resource competition as proof that humans cannot be trusted. And human conservatives probably mirror those arguments about the Gendari, James said, suggesting you're imperialistic, that the peace is temporary, that we should prepare for inevitable conflict resumption. Precisely. Both sides have factions that benefit from mutual antagonism, military interests that justify budgets through external threats, political groups that unite supporters through shared enemies, economics. James looked at the displays, at images of himself that intelligence services had apparently compiled, his service record, his farm on New Terra, even candid photos from recent years that suggested he'd been under observation for some time. You've been planning this for a while. This isn't sudden decision. You've been building toward using my story for diplomatic purposes. I have been considering it since I became Empress 3 years ago, Kureshin admitted. But I needed time to stabilize my political position, to ensure I had authority to pursue cooperation initiatives despite conservative opposition. And I needed to locate you. Tracking one retired medic on a distant colony world took longer than anticipated. What would this role actually involve? James asked. What am I committing to if I accept? Publicly, appearing at diplomatic events, sharing your story in contexts that promote human Gendari understanding, serving as visible example of cooperation between our peoples. You would attend formal functions, participate in cultural exchanges, allow your experience to be documented in ways that reach both Gendari and human populations. She continued, privately, advising me on human perspectives that pure diplomatic briefings miss, helping me understand cultural contexts and sensibilities that formal reports fail to capture, ensuring my policies account for human values and concerns. You would have direct access to me, ability to speak honestly about issues where human and Gendari interests diverge. And if I fail at this, if I'm terrible at court politics and cause diplomatic incidents through ignorance of proper protocols, then we will navigate those incidents together, the Empress said. I am not asking you to become polished diplomat overnight. I am asking you to be authentic representative of the values you demonstrated in Korevel: honesty, compassion, commitment to principles that transcend immediate political calculation. James stood, moved to the windows overlooking the palace gardens, trying to process the implications. His life had been simple for 12 years: farming, community involvement, peaceful existence far from anything politically significant. Accepting this role meant stepping back into public attention, becoming symbol rather than person, carrying responsibility for human Gendari relations he'd never sought. I have conditions, he said finally. If I'm going to represent human Gendari cooperation, I need to be authentic representative. That means speaking honestly about human perspectives even when they're uncomfortable for Gendari audiences, even when diplomatic smoothness suggests softening truths. I can't be effective if I'm just performing scripted role. Agreed, Empress Kureshin said immediately. Authentic honesty is precisely what makes you valuable. I have sufficient diplomats who provide carefully crafted statements. I need someone who will tell me when human interests genuinely conflict with Gendari assumptions, who will challenge my thinking when I'm operating from cultural blind spots. I also need to be able to return to my farm periodically, James continued. This can't be permanent court imprisonment. I need time away from political intensity to maintain perspective. Also agreed. We will establish rotation, periods at court followed by return to New Terra, ensuring you maintain connection to life outside palace politics. James turned to face her. Then I accept. Though I reserve the right to be terrible at formal court behavior, to probably cause at least 3 diplomatic incidents through sheer protocol ignorance, and to occasionally need extensive coaching on proper honorific usage. I expect nothing less, the Empress replied with what was definitely amusement in her scale patterns. We will navigate your cultural mistakes together, turning them into teaching opportunities rather than crises. Your authentic confusion will probably be more endearing than offensive to most observers. She stood, moved to join him at the windows. Thank you, James Sullivan, for choosing to save my life when military logic said to abandon me, for accepting this role when peaceful farming would have been easier, for being willing to build bridges when many prefer to maintain walls. You're welcome, James replied. Though I should mention that last week I apparently insulted 3 of my neighbors through improper use of agricultural equipment near property boundaries, so my bridge-building skills may be overestimated. We will work on your diplomatic capabilities, Kureshin said, starting with intensive briefings on Gendari court culture, political factions, and the various ways you can accidentally cause offense through seemingly innocent actions. That sounds terrifying and exactly what I need, James admitted. The following weeks involved transformation from farmer into cultural liaison through carefully orchestrated process. James received extensive briefings on Gendari political structures, cultural values, historical context for current tensions. He met with diplomatic staff who coached him on protocol, with intelligence analysts who explained conservative faction opposition, with cultural experts who helped him understand the symbolic weight his story carried. His first public appearance was at a formal reception for diplomatic representatives from multiple human colonies. James stood in formal attire that felt uncomfortable, surrounded by beings whose political significance far exceeded his own, and shared his story with the particular terror of someone who'd never sought public attention. 15 years ago, During the Korevel engagement, I found a wounded Gendari commander among the casualties. Military protocols suggested I should retreat with my unit, potentially detain her if circumstances allowed. Instead, I provided medical treatment that saved her life. James kept his voice steady through force of will. That commander is now Empress Kurashin. My choice, made in a moment of crisis based on medical ethics rather than tactical calculation, helped preserve the person who would later negotiate the peace that ended the war. The reception's response was mixed. Some diplomats clearly moved by the story, others skeptical about using individual anecdotes to support broader political arguments. But the story was shared across communication networks, picked up by media outlets, discussed in contexts that reached beyond diplomatic circles. Conservative opposition emerged immediately. Gendari critics argued that James represented exception rather than rule, that one act of compassion didn't erase human expansionist aggression. Human critics suggested the Empress was manipulating a veteran for propaganda purposes, that his story was being used to justify policies that might not serve human interests. But other voices supported the narrative. Veterans from both sides shared their own stories of moments when enemies had shown unexpected honor. Civilians who valued peace spoke about preferring cooperation over renewed conflict. Younger generations who'd grown up during peace rather than war expressed interest in building relationships rather than perpetuating their parents' antagonisms. James navigated it all with the same principle that had guided his medical decisions: honest engagement with immediate circumstances rather than calculated political performance. When asked uncomfortable questions about human military conduct during the war, he acknowledged mistakes rather than defending everything. When Gendari audiences questioned whether humans could be trusted, he admitted that trust required ongoing effort from both sides rather than automatic assumption. His authenticity resonated precisely because it was uncomfortable. He didn't provide simple narratives about virtuous humans and villainous Gendari or vice versa. He acknowledged genuine conflicts of interest, legitimate grievances on both sides, real differences in values and perspectives. But he also insisted those differences didn't require eternal antagonism, that cooperation served both species better than perpetual preparation for renewed war. 6 months into his role as cultural liaison, James stood in the palace gardens during a rare quiet moment, watching Gendari flowering plants create patterns that probably carried symbolic meaning he still didn't fully understand. His communicator chimed with another request for appearance at diplomatic function, another opportunity to share his story, another chance to be symbol rather than person. "You look contemplative." Empress Kurashin's voice came from behind him. She developed habit of finding him during these quiet moments, checking on his well-being without the formality that characterized their public interactions. "Just thinking about how strange my life has become," James replied. 6 months ago, I was worried about irrigation system maintenance and chicken feed costs. Now I'm apparently ambassador representing human Gendari cooperation, and people are analyzing my every public statement for political implications. Regret accepting the role. She moved to stand beside him, her formal bearing relaxed in the private garden space. "Ask me again in a few more months," James said. "Right now I'm still too busy trying not to cause diplomatic incidents through improper honorific usage to have clear perspective. But I think this matters more than farming, even if it's significantly more complicated and definitely more stressful." They stood in companionable silence, watching the patterns of light and shadow across the garden. Finally, Kurashin spoke. "I received report from intelligence services about conservative faction activities. They're planning formal challenge to my cooperation policies, arguing that reliance on human goodwill is dangerous strategic weakness." "Are you surprised?" James asked. "We knew there would be opposition." "Not surprised, but concerned about the challenge's specific nature. They're not questioning my authority directly. That would be too politically risky. Instead, they're questioning your authenticity, suggesting you're either exception that proves their rule about human nature, or that you're deliberately manipulating imperial policy for human advantage. James sighed. So I'm either irrelevant anomaly or dangerous foreign agent. That's better than being considered both simultaneously, I suppose. The challenge will require public response, Kureshin continued. Formal debate where I defend cooperation policies and they argue for renewed military preparation. Your presence would strengthen my position, but it would also expose you to direct political attack. I've been attacked before, James said. Granted, usually by enemy weapons fire rather than conservative political rhetoric, but the principle is similar. Stay focused on your purpose and try not to get killed. The debate is in 3 days. I need to know if you're willing to participate, to defend the cooperation we're building despite personal cost. James thought about the battle in Koravel, about choosing to treat wounded enemy officer when retreat would have been safer, about the 15 years of consequences that followed from one split-second decision to prioritize medical ethics over tactical advantage. I'm willing, he said, though I should warn you that I'm significantly better at trauma medicine than political debate, so my contribution will probably be more earnest honesty than sophisticated rhetorical strategy. Your earnest honesty is exactly what's needed, Kureshin replied. The debate was held in the Great Assembly Hall, broadcast across Gendari networks, and transmitted to human territories through diplomatic channels. James stood beside Empress Kureshin, while conservative faction leaders presented their arguments with sophisticated political language that boiled down to: humans can't be trusted, cooperation is dangerous, preparing for war is safer than hoping for peace. When his turn came, James spoke with the directness of someone who'd never planned to be in this position. I'm not a politician or a diplomat. I'm a former combat medic who made a choice 15 years ago to provide medical care to a wounded enemy officer. That choice wasn't calculated for political advantage. I didn't know who she was or that she'd become empress. I just knew she was dying and I had training that could prevent that. He continued. Conservative factions argue I'm either exception that proves their rule about human nature or that I'm manipulating imperial policy. I can't speak to broader human nature. I can only speak to my own choices and the principles that guided them. I chose to treat wounded regardless of which side they fought for because my medical ethics said all wounded deserved care. That's not manipulation or exception. That's just attempting to maintain principles under difficult circumstances. The conservative response was predictably critical, questioning his motives, his background, whether one act of compassion justified major policy changes. But James noticed something in the audience response. Younger Gendari who'd grown up during peace seemed receptive to his message. Veterans from both sides nodding at his description of wartime ethical choices. Civilians who valued stability showing interest in cooperation over renewed conflict. The debate ended without clear winner. Politics rarely produced definitive conclusions. But the fact that it occurred, that cooperation policies were defended publicly rather than abandoned under pressure, felt like progress even if it was incremental and fragile. Later in private audience chamber, Empress Kureshin said simply, "Thank you. Your participation mattered. Conservative factions will continue opposition, but you demonstrated that human Gendari cooperation has authentic foundation rather than just diplomatic performance." "You're welcome," James replied. "Though I should mention that I'm still terrible at most aspects of court behavior and probably will continue causing minor diplomatic incidents through protocol ignorance." "I've accepted that as permanent feature of your service," Kureshin said with definite amusement. "Your authentic confusion is more valuable than polished diplomatic performance. It reminds everyone that you're a genuine person, rather than carefully constructed political symbol." James continued his role as cultural liaison for 3 years, building relationships across species barriers, demonstrating through daily choices that cooperation was possible when individuals committed to genuine understanding. The peace between humans and Gendari strengthened, not because ancient animosities disappeared, but because enough beings chose to honor the values that James represented. His story became part of both cultures' understanding of the war and its aftermath. The human combat medic who saved the future Empress's life, demonstrating that even enemies could recognize each other's humanity. It was used in educational materials, referenced in diplomatic negotiations, cited as evidence that cooperation served both species better than perpetual conflict. The story concludes with James eventually returning to his farm on New Terra, having served his time as cultural liaison and ambassador. But he maintains connection to the imperial court, continues to advise on human-Gendari relations, remains symbol of the cooperation he helped build. "Do you remember me, human?" Empress Kurashin had asked, and the answer was yes. He remembered the wounded commander he'd chosen to save, the moment that should have been insignificant becoming foundation for peace between civilizations. Sometimes the most important choices are made without knowing their consequences. Sometimes saving one life changes trajectories of billions. Sometimes simple commitment to principles, medical ethics, compassion, honor toward enemies, builds bridges that calculated political strategy could never construct. James Sullivan had been that person, making that choice, discovering that one decision in a moment of crisis could ripple across years and species, proving that hearts and principles could indeed influence the balance between civilizations when individuals chose